In February 2015, 29-year-old tourist Emily Warner from California set out on a winter hike in the area surrounding Denali National Park, full of enthusiasm and trust in a stranger she had met only a few days earlier. 5 days later, she was found by park rangers in critical, life-threatening condition. She was tied to a tree in one of the most remote parts of the park, suffering from frostbite and injuries, carrying memories of how her dream of a mountain adventure had turned, after a horrific crime, into a fight for survival. Emily Warner grew up in San Diego, California, in a middle-class family. Her parents worked in education and raised their daughter with values of independence and a love for nature. Emily graduated with a bachelor's degree in environmental science and worked for an environmental protection organization. She had always loved traveling, especially to wild, sparsely populated regions. By the age of 30, she had visited several national parks across the United States, gone trekking, and possessed basic survival skills. Friends described her as open, trusting, sometimes even too trusting, and as someone who believed in the goodness of strangers. In January 2015, Emily decided to fulfill a long-held dream, to visit Alaska in winter and take part in a winter trekking expedition near Denali National Park. She planned to spend 2 weeks there, from early to mid-February, and intended to join an organized group through a travel company. However, 1 week before her departure, the company informed her that the group had been canceled due to an insufficient number of participants. Emily could have canceled the trip, but she had already taken time off work and purchased plane tickets and equipment. Therefore, she decided to travel alone, hoping to find companions on site or simply spend time at a campground near Anchorage and take day trips into the mountains. On February 7, 2015, Emily arrived in Anchorage, the largest city in Alaska. She stayed at a small tourist hostel in the city center, a place commonly frequented by travelers looking for hiking partners. The hostel had a common room where guests shared experiences, planned routes, and arranged joint excursions. There, on the evening of February 8th, Emily met a man who introduced himself as Brandon Killigan. Brandon Killigan, whose exact age was unknown, was a solidly built man of average height with a short beard and the demeanor of an experienced traveler. He told Emily that he had been living in Alaska for 5 years, working seasonally in the oil fields, and spending his free time hunting, fishing, and mountaineering. He appeared knowledgeable and confident. He spoke about routes, the specifics of winter hiking, and how to avoid dangers. Emily was impressed by his confidence and experience. When she mentioned that her group had been canceled and that she was looking for someone to join her for a hike in the mountains, Brandon offered to accompany her. He said that he was planning a 5-day route through remote areas west of Denali Park, where there were very few tourists and where one could see the real wild Alaska. He assured her that he knew the area well and had the necessary equipment, including a satellite phone for emergencies. Emily had some doubts. Going into remote mountains with a stranger was risky, but Brandon seemed friendly and professional, and his stories about the beauty of Alaska were so captivating that she gave in to the temptation. There were other travelers at the hostel with whom she could have discussed the plan, but most of them already had their own routes or were heading to different regions. Emily decided to trust Brandon. They agreed to leave on the morning of February 10th. Brandon said he would pick her up in his Jeep. They would drive to a remote area, leave the vehicle at a forest parking area, and continue on foot. The route included 4 overnight stays in tents, with a return to the vehicle after 5 days. On February 9th, Emily spent the day preparing for the hike. She purchased additional supplies, checked her equipment, and wrote an email to her parents informing them that she would be leaving on a 5-day hike with a travel companion she had met at the hostel. She left a copy of the planned route at the hostel reception desk, a standard precaution recommended to all tourists. The hostel manager wrote down the name Brandon Killigan, his phone number, and the expected return date, February 15th. On the morning of February 10th, Brandon arrived at the hostel in an old dark blue Ford Bronco. They loaded their backpacks into the trunk and left Anchorage. The road led north and then turned west onto an unpaved road. Brandon was talkative and told stories about the places they passed, the animals one might encounter, and the best photography spots. Emily felt relaxed and began to trust him even more. After about 3 hours of driving, they turned onto a narrow forest road that led to an abandoned parking area at the edge of a vast forest region. The parking lot was empty. In winter, almost no one came there. Brandon said this was good because they could enjoy nature completely on their own. They unloaded their backpacks, locked the vehicle, and Brandon hid the keys under the front wheel, in case something happened and someone needed to return to the car. The first day of the hike passed normally. They walked along a snow-covered trail that led deeper into the forest and then began to climb into the mountains. The weather was cold, around -15 degrees Celsius, but there was no wind. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The air was clear and icy. Brandon showed Emily animal tracks, rabbits, foxes, and sometimes moose. They took breaks, drank hot tea from a thermos, and ate energy bars. In the evening, they reached a small clearing where Brandon suggested setting up their first camp. Brandon set up his tent. Emily set hers up next to it. He made a fire and cooked dinner, freeze-dried meals, and canned food. They sat by the fire and talked about travel and life. Brandon told stories about his adventures in Alaska, some of which sounded unbelievable, but Emily believed him. When it grew dark, the temperature dropped even further, and they retreated to their tents. The night passed quietly, and the second day also passed without incident. They continued their ascent into the mountains and reached a ridge with a breathtaking view of snow-covered peaks and valleys. Emily took photographs and admired the beauty of the landscape. Brandon was attentive and helped carry part of her gear when the climb became steep. In the evening, they set up their second camp in a wind-sheltered hollow. Once again, there was a campfire, dinner, and conversation. But that night, Emily noticed that Brandon was behaving differently. He sat closer to her by the fire than on the first evening. Several times, he touched her hand when handing her a cup of tea. He complimented her appearance and said that she was a brave and interesting woman. Emily felt uncomfortable but did not want to appear rude. She responded politely while trying to keep her distance. When she said that she was tired and wanted to sleep, Brandon suggested that she move into his tent because it was warmer there. Emily refused and said that her tent was completely fine. Brandon did not insist, but his expression changed. It became harder, colder. The third day began with tension. Brandon was silent and walked ahead with fast strides, without turning around or offering breaks. Emily tried to keep up, but she felt that something had changed. Around midday, they reached a particularly remote part of the route where the trail was almost lost beneath deep snow, and there was not another person anywhere in sight. When Emily suggested taking a lunch break, Brandon abruptly turned around and said that they would continue walking as he saw fit, not as she wanted. His voice sounded threatening. Emily became afraid. She tried to remain calm and said that if it was uncomfortable for him to walk with her, they could turn back. Brandon laughed, but it was an unpleasant, cruel laugh. He said that they would not turn back anywhere unless he decided so. Emily realized that she had fallen into a trap. They were dozens of kilometers away from the nearest settlement, without any means of communication, and the only person who could help her had now become a threat. On the evening of the third day, Brandon chose an especially remote spot in the forest surrounded by dense trees. As their campsite, Emily felt rising panic but tried not to show her fear. She helped set up the tents and light the campfire, hoping that Brandon would calm down if she behaved quietly and friendly and that they could return safely. But after dinner, once darkness had fallen, Brandon approached her and grabbed her arm without warning. He said that he liked her and that she should be grateful that he had brought her there. Emily tried to break free, but his grip was strong. She screamed, pushed him away, and ran toward the forest. Brandon caught up with her within seconds and threw her into the snow. Emily fought back, scratched, and screamed, but there was only forest around them, and no one could hear her. Brandon struck her in the face and ordered her to be quiet. What happened next was a nightmare. Brandon dragged her back to the campsite and tied her hands and feet with a rope from his backpack. Emily screamed and begged him to stop, but he did not listen. He raped her, ignoring her pleas and her resistance. It felt as if it lasted forever. When he was finished, Emily lay beaten, in shock, and unable to move in the snow. Brandon sat by the campfire as if nothing had happened. He smoked a cigarette and stared into the flames. Then he turned toward Emily and said that if she told anyone about what had happened, he would find her and kill her. He said that no one would believe her because she had agreed to go with him willingly. Emily did not respond. She lay there, trying to cope with the pain and the shock. The night was agonizing. Brandon left her tied up and threw a sleeping bag over her. However, she herself was wearing clothes soaked with snow and sweat. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Emily was shivering, her teeth were chattering, and she could not sleep. Brandon slept in his tent as if nothing had happened. On the morning of the fourth day, Brandon untied her. He said that they would continue their journey and that he would kill her and leave her body in the forest where no one would ever find it. if she tried to escape or do anything foolish. Emily was too weak and too frightened to resist. She put on her backpack and followed him. They walked in silence all day. Emily thought about escaping, but she knew that attempting to flee in her condition without a map or GPS in such a region would be equivalent to suicide. In the evening of the fourth day, they reached an even more remote area where there were barely any traces of animal paths left. Brandon set up camp and ordered Emily to sit against a tree. He tied her hands behind her back and wrapped the rope around the tree trunk. Then he began to undress her, pulling off her jacket, her sweater, and her thermal underwear. Emily screamed and begged him not to do this, saying that she would freeze, but Brandon did not respond. He removed all of her clothes and left her completely naked in the cold. He said that she deserved it because she had resisted and had not been grateful. He raped her again while she was tied to the tree and struck her every time she tried to resist. When he was finished, he took her clothes, packed them into his backpack, and said that he would leave her there. If she survived until morning, he might come back. Emily cried and begged him not to leave her, saying that she would die. Brandon grinned and said that this was her problem, then walked away, taking both backpacks, all the equipment, the food, and the tents with him. Emily was left alone, tied to a tree, completely naked, at a temperature of minus 22 degrees Celsius. She tried to free herself by pulling on the ropes, but the knots were tightly bound, and her hands quickly lost all sensation due to the cold. She screamed and called for help, but there was only forest, silence, and darkness around her, growing deeper with every passing minute. Hypothermia set in almost immediately. At first, she shook uncontrollably, and her teeth chattered so violently that she feared they would break. Then the shaking began to weaken. This was a bad sign, because from survival training she knew that when shivering stops, hypothermia is entering a critical stage. Her fingers and toes became numb. Her skin first turned deep red, then bluish. She felt the cold penetrating deeper into her chest, into her abdomen, and her heartbeat slowing. The night felt endless. Emily lost consciousness and came to again. Without knowing how much time had passed, she dreamed of her parents, her warm home in San Diego, and the sun on the beach. Then she opened her eyes and saw darkness, snow, trees, and felt pain and cold. Several times, she believed that she was going to die, and she prayed that it would happen quickly so that she would not have to suffer. At some point on the morning of the fifth day, she heard sounds. At first, she thought it was a hallucination. Footsteps in the snow, voices. The sounds grew louder. She tried to scream, but her voice was weak and hoarse. She tried again, gathering all her remaining strength. The voices came closer. Then lantern lights appeared in the darkness, and she saw figures wearing park ranger uniforms. The ranger patrol happened to be in this area. They were conducting a winter inspection of the condition of hiking trails in the wilderness, something they did every few weeks even in the most remote regions. The lead ranger, David Wilson, 42 years old with 20 years of experience in Alaska, was leading a 3-person team. They were following their route when one of the rangers noticed something strange on a tree ahead, a dark shape that was not moving. As they approached, they saw Emily, naked, tied to a tree, covered in frost, her skin bluish, barely breathing. David Wilson later said in an interview that in all his years of service, he had seen many terrible things, but this scene was one of the most horrifying. They immediately radioed emergency services, transmitted the coordinates, and reported that a rescue helicopter was needed. The Rangers quickly cut the ropes, freed Emily, wrapped her in their jackets and sleeping bags, and started a fire. She was conscious but unable to speak, only moaning softly. They gave her something warm to drink and gently massaged her limbs to restore circulation, being careful because they knew that rapid warming can be dangerous in cases of severe frostbite. One of the Rangers, who had medical training, examined her. He noted multiple abrasions, bruises, signs of blunt force trauma, indications of sexual assault, and second and third-degree frostbite on her fingers, toes, and face. The helicopter arrived 40 minutes later. Emily was transported to a hospital in Anchorage. On the way, she lost consciousness. At the hospital, she was immediately admitted to the intensive care unit. The diagnosis was severe hypothermia, frostbite to the extremities, multiple injuries, consequences of sexual violence, dehydration, and exhaustion. Doctors fought for her life for several days. The fingers of her left hand and 3 toes of her right foot had to be amputated due to tissue necrosis. But she survived. When Emily regained consciousness and was able to speak, she told the police everything that had happened. She gave a detailed description of Brandon Killigan. She described the route and where he had left the vehicle. The police immediately began a search. They found the Ford Bronco at the same abandoned parking area where Brandon and Emily had started their hike. The vehicle was unlocked. Inside, they found some of Emily's equipment, her backpack, clothing, and documents. The search for Brandon Killigan began. A database check showed that the man was registered as a resident of Alaska, held a driver's license, and had no criminal record. However, when investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Brandon Killigan was not his real name. His real name was Greg Thomas Martin, and he was wanted in the state of Washington for sexual assault and attempted murder committed 3 years earlier. He had been hiding in Alaska under a false identity. A nationwide manhunt was launched. Martin's photograph was distributed to all law enforcement agencies in Alaska and neighboring states. Rangers and search teams combed the forests, checked cabins, outposts, and campsites. But Martin seemed to have vanished without a trace. Weeks and months passed. He was not found. Authorities suspected that he had either frozen to death in the wilderness or had managed to leave Alaska under another name. Emily spent 2 months in the hospital. Her physical wounds gradually healed, but the psychological ones were deeper. She was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. She suffered from nightmares and panic attacks, could not sleep in the dark, and was afraid of men. Psychologists worked with her daily, but recovery was slow and painful. Emily's parents flew to Alaska as soon as they learned about the incident. They were tormented by guilt for not stopping their daughter from going on the trip, even though they understood that it had been her decision. When Emily was discharged from the hospital, they took her back to San Diego. She never returned to Alaska. In June 2015, 4 months after the crime, a hunter discovered the body of a man in a remote forested area near the border between Alaska and Canada. The body was partially decomposed, but based on clothing and documents, it was identified as Greg Thomas Martin, also known as Brandon Killigan. The forensic examination determined that death occurred approximately 2 weeks after the attack on Emily, as a result of hypothermia and exhaustion. Apparently, he became lost in the forest, ran out of supplies, was unable to reach other people, and froze to death. It was a strange form of justice. Martin died from the same cold to which he had subjected his victim. But this news brought Emily no sense of relief. She told her psychologist that she wanted him to stand trial, be convicted, and sent to prison, rather than simply dying in the forest. She wanted justice, not just the death of the perpetrator. The case was officially closed as solved, with posthumous identification of the offender. The prosecutor's office formally filed charges against Greg Thomas Martin for kidnapping, sexual assault, attempted murder, and unlawful imprisonment. Emily gave testimony even though there was no trial. This testimony was entered into the case file as documentary evidence of the crime. Emily Warner's story became a topic in the press. The media published dozens of articles about the tourist who survived a nightmare in Alaska. Her photograph, taken before the trip, showing her smiling with hope, was published alongside images of snow-covered mountains and headlines such as "A dream turned into hell." For a long time, Emily gave no interviews. But 1 year after the events, she agreed to participate in an interview for a program about survivors of violence. She wanted her story to serve as a warning to others. In the interview, she said, "I trusted him because he seemed normal, experienced, and reliable. I thought I could judge people, but I was wrong. The most terrifying thing is that people like this look just like everyone else. They smile, joke, help you carry your backpack, and only when you are alone with them, far away from everyone else, do they show their true face. I want women to know, do not go with unknown men to remote places, even if they seem safe. Always share your detailed route with someone. Carry communication devices with you, and do not rely on the promises of others. I survived only by chance. The Rangers happened to be in that place. Without them, I would have died tied to that tree." The Rangers who rescued Emily were awarded by the National Park Administration for their heroism. David Wilson said that they had only done their job, but he admitted that the incident changed his perspective on how dangerous not wild animals, but people can be. Emily needed years to recover. She underwent long-term psychotherapy, took antidepressants, and attended support groups for victims of violence. Gradually, she returned to a more normal life. Although it is impossible to fully recover from such trauma, she no longer works for a nature conservation organization. She cannot bring herself to think about the wilderness without fear. Instead, she volunteers with an organization that helps victims of sexual violence and supports other women in coping with the aftermath. Physically, she has adapted to the loss of her fingers. She has learned to live with prosthetics and perform everyday tasks. But the scars remain, not only physical, but psychological as well. She admits that to this day, she is afraid of winter, afraid of the cold, cannot sleep in complete darkness, and avoids places that remind her of forests. The story of Emily Warner is one of those tragedies that remind us that danger does not necessarily come from nature, but from people. Alaska is a harsh place where mistakes can be life-threatening, but sometimes the greatest mistake is trusting the wrong person. Emily dreamed of the beauty of the mountains, of adventure, of freedom. Instead, she suffered a trauma that will accompany her forever. No amount of precaution can completely eliminate the risk. People like Greg Martin exist, and they can camouflage themselves well, gain trust, and create an impression of reliability. The only thing one can do is be cautious, listen to instincts, and remember that trust must be earned through time and proof, not just through a friendly smile and convincing stories. Emily Warner survived. That is what matters most. She went through hell and came back, not unscathed, not the same as before, but alive. And her story is not only the story of a victim, but also the story of a survivor who found the strength to keep living, to help others, and to remind the world that behind a beautiful facade a nightmare can be hidden, and that true strength is the ability to endure that nightmare and not give up.